When you hear the name Ford, you probably think of pickup trucks, assembly lines, and one of the most influential car companies in history. But unlike many famous brands, the answer to why Ford is called Ford is surprisingly simple. It's called Ford because it was founded by a man named Henry Ford. But that simple answer hides a much bigger story. Because before Ford became one of the most recognizable names in the world, Henry Ford had already failed multiple times. In fact, there was a very real possibility that the Ford Motor Company would never exist at all. This is the story of why Ford is called Ford. To understand where the name comes from, we need to go back to the late 1800s. At the time, automobiles were still a novelty. Most people traveled by horse, train, or carriage. Cars existed, but they were expensive, unreliable, and viewed by many as little more than mechanical experiments. One person who saw things differently was a young engineer named Henry Ford. Born on a farm in Michigan, Ford developed an early fascination with machinery. While other children played with toys, he spent much of his time taking watches apart and putting them back together. As he grew older, his interest in mechanics only intensified. Eventually, Ford moved to Detroit and found work as an engineer. During his spare time, he became obsessed with a new invention that was beginning to attract attention around the world: the gasoline-powered automobile. In 1896, after years of experimentation, Ford completed his first vehicle. It was called the quadricycle. The machine looked more like a motorized buggy than a modern car, but it proved something important. Ford could build a working automobile. The success of the quadricycle convinced him that cars represented the future. There was just one problem. Building a prototype is very different from building a business. In 1899, Ford launched his first automobile company. It was called the Detroit Automobile Company. The venture quickly ran into trouble. The cars were expensive, production was slow, and investors became frustrated with the lack of progress. Within 2 years, the company collapsed. Most entrepreneurs would have been discouraged. Ford wasn't. Instead, he returned to experimentation and continued refining his designs. Soon, another opportunity emerged. In 1901, Ford helped create a second company. This one eventually became known as the Henry Ford Company. At first, the arrangement seemed promising. Investors were interested. Production plans were underway. Everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. Then disagreements began. Ford clashed with investors over the direction of the business. The conflicts became so severe that he ultimately walked away from the company bearing his own name. The irony is that after Ford left, the company continued operating under new leadership. Eventually, it was reorganized and renamed. Today, that company is known as Cadillac. In other words, Henry Ford left what would become Cadillac before it ever became Cadillac. For a second time, his automotive ambitions appeared to have failed. But Ford still wasn't finished. By 1903, he was ready to try again. This time, a group of investors agreed to back him with a relatively small amount of capital. The new business needed a name. Unlike modern corporations that spend months researching branding strategies, the choice was straightforward. The company would simply carry the founder's name, Ford Motor Company. At the time, there was nothing particularly unusual about this. Many businesses were named after their founders. But what made Ford different was what happened next. The company's first years were far from guaranteed. Competition was intense. Hundreds of automobile manufacturers existed throughout the United States. Most would eventually disappear. Ford needed a way to stand out. The breakthrough came in 1908. That was the year Ford introduced the Model T. The Model T wasn't the first automobile. It wasn't the fastest automobile. And it certainly wasn't the most luxurious. What made it revolutionary was accessibility. Henry Ford believed cars shouldn't be reserved for the wealthy. He wanted ordinary people to own them. To make that possible, Ford focused on reducing costs and increasing production efficiency. Those efforts eventually led to one of the most important innovations in industrial history, the moving assembly line. Before the assembly line, building a car required workers to move from vehicle to vehicle performing different tasks. Ford reversed the process. The car moved while workers stayed in place. Production times dropped dramatically, costs fell, prices became more affordable, and suddenly millions of people could buy automobiles. The impact was enormous. The Model T became one of the best-selling vehicles in history. Ford Motor Company expanded rapidly. Factories multiplied, sales exploded, and the Ford name became synonymous with the automobile itself. Over time, the name evolved beyond the founder. Most people today don't immediately think of Henry Ford when they hear Ford. They think of trucks, Mustangs, assembly lines, American manufacturing, and more than a century of automotive history. But the company's name remains a direct connection to the man who started it. Unlike brands such as Nike, Visa, or Airbnb, whose names were carefully selected to communicate a specific idea, Ford's name came from something much simpler, the founder himself. Yet perhaps that's fitting, because few individuals have had a greater impact on the automobile industry than Henry Ford. His innovations changed not only how cars were built, but how products of all kinds were manufactured around the world. Today, Ford sells millions of vehicles across dozens of countries. Its logo is recognized globally. Its history spans more than a century, and it all traces back to a mechanic from Michigan whose surname ended up becoming one of the most famous brands on earth. Not bad for a company named after the person who almost failed twice before creating it. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel to get notifications for our new videos. Feel free to suggest other brands we should cover next in the comments below.